You don't need to be fluent to speak Mandarin with AI. These beginner-friendly chatbot activities offer low-pressure practice that build confidence, comprehension, and conversation skills. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about how you can use AI chatbots to improve your Mandarin. There are many ways you can leverage AI for your Chinese learning, but in this episode we're going to focus on speaking activities suitable for beginners and lower intermediate students. I have designed these activities specifically so that you don't have to say a lot if you don't want to, so they are rather input heavy, which normally means listening or reading, depending on if you use the exercises with written Chinese or spoken Chinese. It's one thing to use chatbots if your level is already quite advanced, because then you can just use them as you would use them in your native language. For example, if you have questions you want answers to summarize information, and so on. Maybe discuss ideas for a project you have at home or at work. This doesn't really work for most students though, and there are several reasons for this. The most obvious one is that the language will be too hard, and if you don't specify what type of language you want the AI to use, it will just flood you with words that are way above your level, and you won't understand much and won't benefit much from the exchange either. Another issue is that the AI doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't really try to teach you anything, so you need to be the person who kind of has the initiative and drives the conversation forward. And if you know, say, 500 words in the language, this can be rather difficult. You also need to instruct the AI so it does what you want it to do, although of course you can do this in your native language and then use the activity in Chinese. For the activities that I have designed here, I have included instructions in Chinese, in simple Chinese that you can just paste into your chatbot interface. Speaking anxiety is another issue that I wanted to address with these exercises, because even if there isn't a human on the other end, it's still possible to be worried about what to say or feel deeply anxious about the whole exchange. So in these activities that I've designed here, you don't have to say much, and I will basically provide all the Chinese that you need to use these activities. This doesn't mean you can't use more Chinese actively with these exercises if you want, but it does mean that you don't have to. I should also mention that if you know very little or no Chinese, using a chatbot is a really bad idea. You should use materials that are designed for complete beginners instead. I have already in other articles and episodes presented lots of suggestions for what to listen to and read, and I'll put links to these articles in the show notes. Essentially what I'm saying is that you need basic vocabulary in Chinese for these exercises to work, because they are entirely in Chinese. And it's a bit hard to quantify this precisely, but I would estimate that you need roughly around HSK 1, and I'm talking about new HSK 1, which is about 500 words, to benefit from these activities. It's of course easier if you know more than this, but if you know much less, I would consider doing something else instead. So I already mentioned that you don't need to say a lot when engaging in these activities, but there are a few things you need to say, otherwise it would just be pure input, and if that was the case, I would just recommend using YouTube or good podcasts for beginners and the like. There is no need to use a chatbot. So the things you need to be able to say in Chinese is to, for example, ask what something means, or how to say something in Mandarin, or ask it to repeat something or paraphrase something. And I've included these phrases in the written article on Hacking Chinese, but I see little point in reading through the list here. So we will just move on to the first activity. So for each activity, I've included a summary, I've included instructions for you so you know what to do, and I've also included instructions for the AI written in simple Chinese. You don't have to read these descriptions and you don't have to understand them, but I've deliberately written them in a simple language to essentially prompt the AI to also use similarly simple language. There is also a link to an example chat log with ChatGPT where I've tried this activity so you can see what it looks like in practice. Finally, I have included variants, and most of these variant activities are on the same level, so they are not more difficult, but some of them also make it significantly harder, and if that's the case, I've indicated that too. So activity number 1 is 20 questions, and I think most people are familiar with this activity, but in case you aren't, it's essentially about thinking about something, perhaps an everyday object such as a cup or something like that, and then seeing if the AI can guess what item you're thinking about using 20 questions. Naturally, 20 here is just an arbitrary number and there is no specific reason to stop at 20. But essentially, the AI will ask you yes or no questions, and so you are only required to answer yes or no, or perhaps sometimes maybe or I don't know. The AI uses the information it gleans from your answers and then tries to guess the object. There are many ways of varying this activity, so don't take an everyday object. Take a, say, person, a celebrity, a location, a profession, an animal, an action, or something else. If you feel confident to do so, you can also reverse the roles, so you are the one asking the questions and you try to figure out what object or person the AI is thinking about. Before we move on to activity number 2, I should also say that I have included activity-specific phrases and words that you need, so if you don't know how to say these things in Chinese, you can check the written article on Hacking Chinese, which contains basically all the language you need to say yourself. Okay, so activity number 2 is guess the word. This is an activity where the chatbot describes an everyday object and you are supposed to guess what it is. Sometimes the AI might say a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more, and it's of course fine to guess as many times as you want. This activity can be easier than 20 questions because you don't have to understand everything to be able to guess the answer. For example, there could be a clue that you just missed, but if you have 3 other clues that you did get, well, then you might be able to guess the object anyway. This activity can be varied in almost exactly the same way as 20 questions, so just change the topic. And you can also reverse the roles, so you describe something, maybe sentence by sentence, and the AI has a guess at what you are thinking about. And this is very similar then to playing word games, which is something we discussed in episode 73. And this is one of my favorite activities for learning Chinese in general, and it works really well with chatbots too. Okay, let's move on to activity number 3, which is co-created stories. This is an activity where the chatbot tells you a story in segments, and you then provide input by choosing how this story should progress or what should happen in the story. I have provided a bunch of seed phrases for different stories in the written article on Hacking Chinese, but the chatbot is usually quite good at turning even mundane things into moderately interesting stories, so you can basically ask it to tell you a story about anything. You can also vary the activity by giving input more or less often, or by having more or less choices. And in the version that I have presented in the article and the instructions you can paste, I have chosen some sentences, a few sentences, and then you have 4 options. But you could, like I said, have much longer segments before you are asked to give some kind of input. You can have more than 4 choices, or you can just say something yourself. It doesn't have to be multiple choice. But remember, the activities here were meant to not force you to speak a lot, and that's why I have a multiple choice. As was the case with the other activities, I have provided more variants on how to instruct the AI to go with those variants in the written article. So those were the 3 activities that I wanted to introduce, and now I want to talk a little bit about some practical aspects of using chatbots for these activities, well, and for similar activities. I tried these out with ChatGPT's 4.0 model, so some of the things that I'm saying here might be obsolete if you listen to this in the far future, but most of these things will probably stay relevant for a few years at least. If you use ChatGPT specifically, I strongly suggest you check the advanced voice mode, which allows you to interrupt. So for example, if the AI is trying to make you guess the word, and you can guess the word after 1 sentence, you can just say your answer and the AI will listen and stop talking and say whether you guessed it correctly or not. You can also ask it to speak more slowly, which is nice. Something you should consider doing regardless of what chatbot you're using is to set the input language to Mandarin specifically, not just any language. Because sometimes when you give one-word answers, the chatbot can't really know what language you're speaking, even if your pronunciation is perfect. For example, when I tried out the 20 questions as a speaking activity, I basically only said 是 as in yes, that's correct, or 不是 as in no, that's not the case. But sometimes the AI thought that my 是 was sure in English, which is, well, pronounced somewhat similarly, but not that similar. So it basically just identified the incorrect input language. Maybe because I normally speak English with it, I don't know. But this could be an issue. So if you specify that you will speak Chinese, maybe it is less likely to think you're speaking Spanish or French. Naturally, if you're a beginner, this might not be a good idea because being able to say something in English if the activity goes off track or if something else happens is kind of convenient. So don't do this unless it is a problem. You will run into situations where the AI misunderstands what you say, and there are essentially two reasons this might happen. The first reason is that your answer is not clear, so a human would also misunderstand what you say or find it difficult to understand. And this means that the AI transcribed what you said correctly into text, but then wasn't able to understand what you meant. The other potential reason for misunderstandings is when the AI transcribes what you say incorrectly. We already saw one example of this when it thought that when I said "shi" in Chinese, it actually thought I said "sure" in English, and then of course the conversation will be very, very awkward. And if you're doing this as a speaking-only activity, you might not even realize that the AI mistranscribed what you said. So I didn't know that the AI thought I said "sure" instead of "shi" before I checked the transcript. There are also many non-linguistic reasons for the AI being bad at transcribing what you say. For example, if you do this outside and there's a little bit of wind, this can have a huge impact on the accuracy of the transcriptions. Of course, it could also be that your pronunciation is not very clear and that a human would also have misunderstood what you said or found it difficult. Before wrapping up this episode, I'd like to say a few words about the principles that I used when designing these activities. I see a lot of people using chatbots for language learning in the most traditional sense, so essentially asking for explanations of grammar and translating the text to English and things like that, which sometimes can be useful, but these were not the types of activities that I talked about in this episode. Instead, all three activities have a clear focus on meaning, not form. So it's about understanding what the chatbot is saying and responding to it. It's not about using a specific word, practicing a grammar pattern, or something like that. It's about communication in Chinese. I also wanted to design activities where your answers build to something else. So it's not just an answer for the sake of giving an answer. You could ask a chatbot to ask 100 questions about yourself, but this becomes very repetitive and boring quite fast. And finally, I didn't want to require too much speaking or writing from you. These are meant to be input-heavy activities, and all the phrases and words that you do need are included in the article. Naturally, I cannot include all the language that the chatbot will use, but I can make sure that you know what to say and don't need to fumble or look around and feel stupid for not knowing how to say something. I also want to point out that since these activities are about meaning and communication, it's not necessary to understand every single word that the chatbot says. Just enough that you can engage in the activity. So for example, if you think that you can answer the questions in 20 questions, even if you missed a few words, then that's fine. Of course, if you don't understand any of the questions, well, then that activity is probably too hard, but I just want to point out that I don't want you to look up every single word and feel that if you missed a single one, these activities are too hard for you. I don't think they are, and it's also useful to practice dealing with Chinese that contains a few words you don't understand and see if you can get at the intended meaning anyway. And remember, there is no pressure here. The AI will not judge you and nobody else will hear what you say. That's it for this episode, and if you try any of these activities out, I'd be delighted to hear about it, so please head over to Hacking Chinese and leave a comment. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.